The first blow came not from wind or frost, but from a man's voice just behind her shoulder, sharp, nasal, and louder than the cold air ought to allow. "That'll melt by spring, widow." She didn't turn, didn't blink, just kept pressing the wet clay with the heel of her hand, smoothing the corner seam between the wall and the roof beam, pushing mud into the join with a kind of unblinking purpose that unnerved some men. But not Levi Plank. Levi laughed, spitting chew into the snow as he leaned against a frostbitten pine. "If the rain don't wash it off, the wind'll tear it down. You packing your things before Christmas or after?" Others joined his laughter. Not many, 3 or 4 men. The ones who rode out past her claim every week or so just to see if she'd given up. She hadn't. The woman's name was Ruth Merrin, 32. Widowed 2 winters earlier in Kansas Territory after a fever took her husband before the homestead could be titled. She'd buried a child before that, another after, then disappeared from what little remained of the town that forgot her name. Only one man had watched her go, a neighbor. He'd said nothing, just watched as she loaded her mule with sacks of clay, a dented kettle, and a folded canvas roof. By the time Ruth Merrin reached the high prairie edge where no one else built, where wind cut through ribs and rattlesnakes deaned under frozen scrub, she was already planning the walls. She never meant to build what they did. The others dragged logs, she dug trenches, they raised timbers, she molded clay, and every time they passed by, settlers, traders, mail riders, even children, they laughed. "You trying to make pottery out here?" one woman had asked. "Or you just too poor to chop a tree?" She had no answer. She was already mixing soil and straw. But what none of them noticed, not then, was how she moved with the land, how she built into the rise, not above it, how her home sat half below the grade, the roof not peaking but sloping low like the hides of buffalo bedding against the wind. They saw walls the color of old blood, mud cracked and wet, and they laughed. But Ruth knew something they didn't. She'd lived through a Kansas freeze that tore log cabins in half. She'd seen frost heave buckle-split beams and turn floors into traps. She remembered the night she held her infant against her chest and felt his warmth vanish as wind howled through a log seam no wider than a finger. The firewood hadn't helped. Nothing had. So she built from the earth, thick, low, tight, not pretty, not proud, just strong. It took all fall. She carried water from a half-frozen stream in tin buckets that burned her hands. She shoveled dirt with a half-broken spade until her knuckles split and bled. She chopped straw from dry grass bundles with a kitchen knife and stirred them into clay until it clung like bread dough to her arms. She packed it by hand. She smeared it with her fingers. She molded walls a foot thick, then left them to harden while the wind slapped dust against them like a test. Every step someone watched. Sometimes children, sometimes men with rifles and folded arms. A preacher once. None offered help. Some brought laughter. One brought his dog to piss against her wall. She never responded. The clay cabin rose like a slow tide, each wall squat and rough. The roof pinned down with saplings lashed together and layered in grass sod and canvas. She left no windows, only one thick door she built herself from planks salvaged from a broken wagon bed, hinges made of leather, a latch from bent iron. By November, it was done. She lit her stove, and when the first snows fell, Ruth Merrin vanished from view. No one worried for her. Most assumed she'd moved on, or frozen. Her chimney barely smoked. No candlelight showed through the door seam. She didn't come to town, didn't fetch supplies. They joked about it, how long she'd last buried in a mud ball. One of the plank boys even rode out just to poke the wall with a stick. It didn't give. He came back saying the place stank like damp earth and women's desperation. But the snow kept falling. By mid-December, the valley cabins groaned under the weight of sleet. Logs cracked. Chinking fell out in strips. Wind screamed between beams. One family lost a roof during a night storm, woke to snow on their blankets. Another cabin's wall bowed in under ice. Everyone cursed the cold, and firewood vanished faster than kindling could be chopped. And then it got worse. New Year's Eve brought a cold no one in that part of the territory had felt in 20 years. It came sudden, like a fist behind the eyes. Temperatures dropped past -30 by dusk. The kind of freeze that kills chickens in their coops and splits horseshoes. Men wrapped their stoves in wet burlap to keep them from bursting. Women stuffed quilts into wall seams. Children slept in piles like dogs. And still the cold came. Then one by one the cabins failed, not all at once. A beam here, a stove crack there. Chimneys gave out. Fires died. By the second night, half the valley was living in other people's homes, jammed together like freight. Families with newborns rode out looking for shelter, anything warmer. That's when someone said it. Not a joke this time. "You remember the widow's hut? The one made of clay?" They did. They said it as if they'd just remembered it might be real, that maybe it hadn't collapsed, that maybe it held, but no one wanted to be the first to check. Not until Levi Plank's youngest collapsed from the cold in the middle of the floor. Blue lips, barely breathing. The ride was silent. 5 men, 1 child wrapped in blankets, 1 torch. When they reached the rise, they stopped their horses. No one laughed now. The wind screamed over them and down across the prairie, carrying snow sideways. But her cabin, her strange, squatted clay shelter, was still there. No drift piled against it, no cracks in the wall. The door looked the same. Then they saw the light, thin, dim, flickering through a crack between door and frame. Levi knocked, once, twice, nothing. He raised his hand to try again. Then the door opened. Ruth stood there, her eyes red but wide awake. The air that came out behind her was warm, damp, the smell of boiled corn. She said nothing, just looked at them, then looked down at the boy and stepped aside. They entered in silence. The clay walls glowed orange in firelight. No frost inside, no wind. The floor was warm, packed hard and dry. Her stove ticked gently. The boy stopped, shivering. One of the men removed his gloves, rubbed his fingers on the wall, then just sat down, stunned. Outside, the blizzard screamed. Inside, no one made a sound, and when Levi finally looked her in the eyes, his mouth opened. No mockery now, but Ruth had already turned back to her stove. She stirred her pot, as if she hadn't heard them laugh, as if she didn't know what they'd all said, as if she'd been waiting. For 3 nights the storm raged. Snow didn't fall, it swept, a great sheet of it, horizontal, biting, moving in gusts, thick as smoke. It wasn't the kind of cold that bit. It clamped, the sort of freeze that turned breath to ice before it could settle, that killed calves in birthing, that snapped the limbs off trees like brittle matchsticks. And in that time, Ruth's clay cabin became a legend. It began with Levi Plank and the others. They stayed the first night out of desperation, but by the second evening, none dared leave. Word traveled, not far at first. A boy rode back through the wind to tell his mother. She let us in. It's warm in there. She's got potatoes boiling. The mother arrived by dawn, half frostbitten, with 2 children bundled in pelts on a single pony. Behind her, another neighbor, then 2 more. Within the next 12 hours, 7 more settlers came knocking. Some didn't knock. They collapsed at the door. Ruth opened it for all of them. Her cabin wasn't large, but the way it was built, sunken into the slope, walls packed with earth, the roof low and sod-covered. It held heat like a jar sealed for winter. The floor stayed dry. The wind couldn't find a seam, and the stove, built small on purpose, efficient by necessity, never once went out. She rationed her food, not by word but by instinct, a ladle thinner each time, an extra handful of snow in the stew pot. She didn't hoard. She didn't scold. When a child sobbed from hunger, she offered a boiled potato peeled in half. And when someone offered coin, she shook her head once. "This is shelter," she finally said, "not trade." By the 3rd night, there were 21 souls inside, a dog, a nursing mother, 2 newborns, a man coughing blood, and still the walls held. The settlers spoke low, as if loud voices might wake the wind. Some looked around the clay and whispered, "It ain't right, should have caved in by now." Others touched the walls with fingers and eyes wide as children seeing stone for the first time. One woman wept openly. "Our cabin split," she said. "The chinking turned brittle and popped right out. We burned the ladder to keep the baby's fingers warm." Someone else whispered, "We heard she was crazy, mixing mud like a witch. But this is the only place standing." Ruth didn't respond. She was spooning something thick into a bowl, didn't even glance up. They called her Widow, mostly. Some didn't know her name, others pretended not to. But after that night, no one laughed. The storm broke on the 5th day. Just before dawn, the wind quieted to a hush so sharp it rang in the ears. The sky glowed like metal. Snow had blown in swells and ridges across the prairie. Buried fences, horses, sheds. Smoke no longer rose from any other chimney. One man stepped outside, just stood in it, breathing air that no longer scalded his lungs. His boots sank to the knee. The cabin behind him looked the same, mud-brown, thick, the roof dark and unbothered by weight. Only the door showed signs of wear, scuffed raw from boots, cracked slightly where snowmelt had frozen in a seam. But the rest, untouched. Soon, others ventured out, quiet, humbled. One woman fell to her knees in the snow and wept, not from grief, but exhaustion. She touched the clay wall, whispering, "It saved us. The mud saved us." A child asked if they could stay. "Can we live here now? We don't gotta go back, right?" Ruth didn't answer. She was already gathering her kettle. She moved slowly, as if the storm had left something inside her stiff. Not pain, but memory. She didn't speak often, but when she did, her words carried weight. "No one lives here," she finally said. "They pass through." No one argued. But when they left, they looked back, often, not with pity or mockery anymore, but awe. By the end of January, word had spread farther. A trader from the east heard of the Mud Woman, who kept 20 folks alive in a clay box. A preacher stopped by to pray over the miracle. He left confused, said it felt more like Old Testament justice than grace. Some tried to mimic it. One man tried packing mud between logs. His walls cracked in the thaw. Another gathered river clay, forgetting to mix straw. The whole wall slumped after a freeze. They came to her asking how she did it. Some begged. Some offered coin. She gave no secrets. But the truth was, it wasn't secret. It was old. She'd learned it not from books or settler tales, but from an old widow back in Kansas who'd said only once in passing, "Earth remembers how to keep heat, child. Wood just tries to forget." She'd never forgotten that line, and now the valley wouldn't forget her. In spring, a wagon came from out east, not looking for her, but for land, a surveyor, a stranger. He stopped when he saw the structure. Knocked. She opened. He blinked. "This your place?" She nodded. He tilted his head. "Never seen a build like this on a claim this side of the red." She said nothing. He stepped forward, running a gloved hand across the wall. "Clay. Still firm, even after snow melt." He looked closer. "Thatch mix, earth pack, adobe-like." He squinted. "But this ain't Pueblo land. How'd you figure?" She shut the door. He left, but not before scribbling in a little black notebook. "Unusual structure. Appears sound. Survived exceptional freeze. Note for future study." He never came back, but others did. People with broken homes, with burned barns, with babies. They came not for charity, but instruction. And Ruth in time relented. Slowly, she let one woman help repack a cracked corner. Another boy watched her mix straw with water. An old man brought her clay in trade for guidance. Still, she said little, but she watched and nodded when it was right. She never used blueprints. She never taught like a teacher. But the hills around her cabin soon bore signs of her presence. Small mounds, walls no higher than a waist, half finished, half packed. And when spring rain came, most held. But then came the fire, not hers. A mile west, a cabin caught, stove flare, burned fast. Flames snapped the roof like matchwood. Wind carried sparks across dry grass, through fence lines, toward other homes. People ran, fought it with rags, water buckets, screamed. But Ruth's cabin didn't burn. It couldn't. Fire hit the sod roof and died, licked the walls and curled, charred the door but didn't break it. By the time the smoke cleared, 4 homes had gone to ash. Hers stood blackened, intact. After that, they stopped calling her crazy. Some started calling her blessed. Others said she was a witch. But most, even the stubborn men who'd once laughed, just called her Ruth. And when she passed a settler's child in town who said, "Mama, that's the mud lady," the mother didn't scold. She just knelt and whispered, "That lady saved our life, you know." The child nodded. Ruth kept walking. She didn't need thanks. She had walls. Spring didn't come fast to the valley. It never did. Snow clung like rot in the shaded gullies. Ice stayed in the stream beds long past the equinox. And the wind, though no longer screaming, still moaned like a thing remembering its own fury. But the settlers came out of their broken cabins like frost-bitten moles, blinking at the daylight, moving slow, cautious, ashamed of what they'd lost. What remained of the valley town, 8 working homes, a blacksmith shop, a church with its roof half gone, and 2 barns with one whole wall between them, began to gather around a new topic, mud. No one called it clay, not then. They didn't know to, not until Ruth. She didn't speak much, but her presence had shifted. People didn't whisper anymore when she entered the dry goods store. They nodded, sometimes even tipped their hats. One boy called her Miss Ruth, and offered to carry her sack of flour. She refused, but didn't scowl. That was new. Then quietly, the questions started. "Did you mix straw in yours? How thick should the wall be to hold the heat? What did you seal the inside with? Just more mud?" Ruth answered only when she felt like it, usually with one-word replies, sometimes a grunt. But one day, as the preacher's wife stood beside her at the well and asked if she'd mind explaining how to make the mix not crack, Ruth looked her in the eye and said, "Come by after supper." Word spread like grass fire. That evening, 5 people showed up. By the end of the week, it was 14. Not a sermon, not a lecture. Just Ruth, standing by a large stone basin she'd carved into the earth near her cabin, a shovel in one hand, a dry root in the other, explaining nothing unless asked. She didn't ask them to copy her. She showed them how the land worked. Let them feel the weight of soaked soil. Let them pack it into a brick. Let them fail, and fail again, until their walls didn't crack. One woman left crying with gratitude. Another man left cursing, but came back the next day with better straw. Ruth never smiled. But something loosened in her. She didn't send them away. She even let a child help stack drying bricks near her shed. They started calling it Ruth Mud. It wasn't fancy. It was thick, ugly, strong. It stuck under your fingernails and left your skin dry for days, but it held. And by midsummer, the hills began to change. You could see them from the ridge, half-built domes, squat huts, clay chimneys. Not just one family now, 7. They weren't all the same. Some had wooden beams, others had windows, but all of them had one thing in common: dirt walls and quiet gratitude. The Plank family never rebuilt. After the storm, their home was beyond repair. The stovepipe had split from ice. The back wall bowed out like wet paper. Levi himself had changed. Something in him had broken, not from guilt exactly, but shame. He still rode out, sometimes with his boys, but not to mock Ruth. He came to learn. He never apologized, not out loud. But one day he left her a pile of well-cut straw with no note. Another day, he fixed the broken latch on her woodshed without a word. She didn't mention it. But when his youngest boy showed up with frostburn scars along his cheeks and asked to help carry clay, she let him. Then came the traders, not valley folk, outsiders, men who traveled with wagons full of buttons and needles, salt and soap. They'd heard rumors of earth cabins that don't freeze. At first they laughed, then they saw them. One man, a German with a thick beard and wide hat, walked the whole hill ridge, touching walls and humming to himself. "This is old," he said. "Older than you think. This is Earthcraft." No one understood what he meant, but Ruth did. When he knocked on her door, she didn't answer, but she let him leave a wrapped bundle at her step. Inside, a book, leather-bound, handwritten, Spanish mostly, sketches of earth homes, ancient. She never showed it to anyone, but her methods changed, slightly. She began adding ash to her base mix. She carved vent holes in new walls before sealing them. She dug narrow drainage lines around the outside edge of her cabin and lined them with smooth stone. And people noticed. Not everyone liked it. The old-timers, the ones who still trusted log and plank, began to grumble. "She's starting to act like some priestess out there. Don't feel right. Dirt ain't a home. She never did marry again. Maybe she thinks she's better than us." But their voices were quieter now. Because when the next hard frost hit in early autumn, a surprise freeze that shattered window glass and killed a newborn calf in its pen, the only homes that didn't lose heat were the ones built with Ruth mud. Then, for the first time, she spoke publicly. Not at a church, not in town, but when the first settler child from a new family fell ill and the father came begging, Ruth stepped out, folded her arms, and said in a tone that cut through the cold, "You build that wall wrong. It'll kill your baby." He blinked, stunned. "You packed it dry, didn't mix it long enough, didn't add ash. Your corners'll split, then the cold'll come in," he stammered. Can you show me?" She turned. "Come at first light. Bring your shovel." He did, and the others followed, but she had limits. When a man from a nearby county offered gold coin for her to build him one from scratch, she laughed, once, dry. "Build your own," she said, "or go sleep under bark." Some didn't understand. To them, Ruth was a builder, a recluse, a legend. But to Ruth, it was never about mud. It was about memory. She'd buried children, a husband. She'd watched homes die under frost. The earth was not her miracle. It was her grave, her shield, her language. They didn't know that, but she built anyway. The following winter was worse, longer, colder. A full month below zero. The river froze 2 feet deep. Chickens died inside coops. Smoke from broken chimneys stained the snow. But the clay homes stood. One roof collapsed under a fallen tree. Another caved from a poorly placed stove. But none from the cold, and not a single child died. Not one. That spring, Ruth came down with fever. Not sudden, slow. She didn't tell anyone. She kept working, but her hands shook more. Her breath grew short. One day she fell while hauling a water bucket. A boy found her. They carried her inside. For 2 days, she barely spoke. Then she sat up and said, "The chimney needs sealing." No one argued, but something changed. The people she once kept at arm's length now filled her cabin. Quiet, respectful, bringing her food, tending the fire, patching the clay around the hearth with care. And Ruth, at last, let them. She didn't speak of death, didn't ask for a preacher, just pointed to where the water seeped in and murmured, "That wall needs another hand." They gave her 10. By summer, she was gone, not buried in town. They asked, but she'd written a single line on parchment folded beside her sleeping cot. "Let the earth hold me like I held it." So they did. They built her a chamber of her own mud, low, round, set into the hill beneath her cabin. They packed it with clay and straw, sealed it with stone, and marked the entry with a small wooden sign, "Ruth Merrin, Mother of Earth Walls." And when winter came again, as it always did, the wind howled through the valley, but never reached the hill, because her walls still stood, and so did her memory. The year after Ruth Merrin's death changed the valley in ways no storm ever had. Her cabin still stood, untouched, uninhabited. No one dared move in, not from superstition, but reverence. They called it the first Earth House, and though no one said it aloud, it was treated almost like a chapel, not religious, Not sacred in the biblical sense, but something older, something that made people instinctively remove their hats before stepping near it. The earth that had once been laughed at, mocked as mud, muck, witch wall, was now taken seriously. The 7 clay homes on the hill grew to 12, then 16. The ridge above the river, once blanketed in pine and scrub, bore a new kind of homestead. Quiet, low, strong, built with calloused hands and packed with the lessons Ruth had given in fragments and gestures. But something else grew with it, not just homes, memory. Someone began collecting Ruth's methods into pages. At first they were scribbled notes by a woman named Eliza, once a merchant's wife, now a widow herself. She'd come to Ruth in the winter of the storm, with 2 sick children and barely a blanket between them. Ruth had saved her family, and Eliza had never left. After Ruth passed, Eliza took it upon herself to gather everything Ruth had said, each muttered instruction, every motion of the hand, every moment where silence had taught more than words. She called the collection Earthen Ways. She didn't print it, not at first. She wrote it by hand, 15 pages, then 30, then more, as neighbors added their observations, mistakes, improvements. It wasn't a book. It was a living record, and by the next spring, copies of it, inked carefully on rough paper, bound with twine or canvas, began to appear in homes from one valley to the next. Not all settlers embraced it. A few diehards, proud of their log craft, still scoffed. One man built a towering pine cabin with carved shutters and window trims, only to watch its entire west wall collapse after an early frost cracked the support beam. Others took notice. Soon younger men and women came riding in from other towns asking questions like pilgrims. Is this where she lived? Can I see the wall that didn't break? Did she really build it alone? Did she really save them all? To each, Eliza gave the same answer. She didn't build it to be seen, she built it to live. Then she'd walk them to the cabin, gesture toward the sealed room built beneath it, and say softly, "That's where she rests. Same walls, same clay." One man, a traveling teacher from Missouri, sat against the side of the cabin and stayed there for 3 hours, staring at the wall like it might reveal something to him. When he rose, he whispered, "I'll never build a square cabin again." He kept his word. But with attention came other things. Attention always brings trouble eventually. That summer, a government agent came through the valley. He wasn't local, he wasn't friendly, wore spectacles too clean, coat too pressed, his boots weren't scuffed. That alone made folks wary. He claimed he was surveying unusual structures for a county register, but he asked too many questions, took too many notes. He lingered too long around Ruth's cabin, peered too close at the way the sod roof bent with the rise of the hill. He even pulled a bit of clay from the base wall and sniffed it. When Eliza confronted him, he smiled thinly, just cataloguing ingenuity, nothing harmful. But the townsfolk didn't like it. A man named Carson, once a builder of log cabins, now a quiet convert to Ruth Mudd, followed the agent to the inn that night and warned him straight. "You try to tear it down, we'll stand in front of it. And if you try to sell it, you'll find the road out of here a whole lot longer than the one you came in on." The agent left before sunrise, took his notes with him, but never returned. That fall brought another freeze, not the kind that made the almanacs, but sharp, fast. A hunting party got caught out in it. One man died, another lost a finger to frost. But none of the valley homes cracked, not one. Fires stayed lit, children stayed warm, chickens lived, and that was the year they stopped calling the place a settlement. It wasn't much by size, a cluster of earth homes, a simple dry goods store, a shared well, and a forge run by a quiet man with a limp, but it was solid, enduring. And people began calling it Ruth Hollow, not officially, not on maps, but in every letter written to kin, every whisper sent across wagons. That was the name that spread. Ruth Hollow, where the mud don't freeze. By the next year, the name stuck like clay. But the weather wasn't done testing them. The third winter after Ruth's death brought a blizzard so wide it swallowed 3 counties. It rolled in from the north with no warning, devoured fence lines, buried cattle alive, flattened 3 barns near the rail trail. Mail stopped for 9 days. A family, in the next valley, froze to death with the pot still on the stove. When it reached Ruth Hollow, no one panicked. They sealed their chimneys, packed their walls again, lit stoves with long burning coals, and they waited. No home failed. A baby was born during the storm, in a clay cabin with a sod roof and a stove made from Ruth's design. She was named Merrin. The mother wept as snow battered the roof and said aloud to the walls, "You kept her warm." That spring, something unexpected happened. A young boy, not more than 12, dug into the earth near the rise by Ruth's original cabin. No one knew why. He wasn't supervised, just a restless child with a rusted spade. But what he uncovered caused a quiet stir. Buried near the root line of a storm-felled tree, he found a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Inside, a leather pouch, worn near to cracking, and inside that, 5 letters. Not addressed, not sealed, but clearly written in Ruth's hand. They weren't instructions, they were memories. One spoke of her husband. He thought logs would keep us warm. But the cold always found its way in. I watched our daughter die with her lips blue and his arms wrapped round her. I never blamed him. I blamed the cracks in the wood. Another was shorter. Clay doesn't lie. It shows you where you failed. Then you fix it. It don't pretend. A third simply said, the earth is quiet, but it remembers. If I make my home in it, maybe it'll remember me. Eliza read them aloud at the next gathering. No one cried. They just sat in silence, eyes on the floor, hands clasped or still, listening to a woman who had never spoken this much in life, but had somehow found her voice in death. They placed the letters in a box and sealed it in Ruth's old stove, the one that had never gone out. It hasn't since. By the 5th year, the valley was full. 30 homes, most clay, some hybrid. One young couple tried stone. Another used bark, packed with earth, but all of them, every last one, followed Ruth's principles. Thick walls, low ceilings, earth and insulation, respect for silence. A teacher came through, hired by the town's first school group. He brought books, blackboards, and ink. The first lesson he gave was on measurements. The second was on adobe structures of the Southwest. But the children raised their hands. One girl said, "That's not quite right." Ruth packed the straw first. Another said, "She'd never use sand like that. Makes it too brittle." The teacher adjusted his lessons. They knew more than he did. One spring, a traveler passing through tried to offer coin for Ruth's cabin, said he wanted to turn it into a shrine, build a proper roof over it, charge visitors a nickel to tour it. They said no, not just Eliza, the town. As a vote was held, impromptu, shouted across wagons and porch steps. Unanimous. No one owns it, and no one sells it. She didn't build it to be seen, she built it to live, and no one ever tried again. By the 7th year after Ruth Merrin's death, Ruth Hollow had become more than a place. It had become a story, told in distant towns by traders who never saw it, whispered at rail depots, printed in snippets in traveling newsletters as something half real. The valley where the homes don't crack, the woman who beat the frost with clay, a widow who built better than any man. But in the hollow itself, no one spoke in fables. They remembered her in work, in silence, in the feel of wet earth between their fingers, as they packed their own walls each autumn. No statues were built, no plaques raised. But if you walked the hills in winter, you'd see the proof of her memory in every ember glow of a stove burning slow, in every child sleeping soundly while the wind screamed outside. And yet, there was still unfinished work. One afternoon in early spring, Eliza stood outside Ruth's cabin, staring at the earth near the rise. A few saplings had grown in the runoff line, roots curled under the stone where they shouldn't. Eliza crouched, dug with bare fingers, and winced. The drainage needed repacking. She looked to the slope, then called. In under an hour, 4 neighbors arrived. None asked what was needed. They brought spades, buckets, straw. They began to dig, not with noise, not with talk, but with a kind of quiet rhythm. Eliza mixed ash. The youngest girl, barely 10, folded straw bundles like she'd seen Ruth do. They laid new stone, remixed clay, rebuilt the earthwork wall exactly as Ruth had taught. By sundown, the water would run clean again. That night, Eliza stood by the old stove and lit a lantern. The flame caught low, steady. She looked around the room, unchanged after all these years. Clay walls thick as ever, the ceiling beams low and sloped, the single chair still set by the door, as if waiting. She whispered into the quiet. We remembered, and she left. As the years passed, children grew, elders passed, and Ruth Hollow slowly shifted from a homestead to a kind of frontier commune. No one ruled it. There was no mayor, no constable, but there were rules, unspoken, inherited. You built with earth. You helped your neighbor before they asked. You didn't sell what was taught freely. You kept your fire burning slow, and your door was never fully closed in a storm. Travelers continued to arrive. Some came to gawk, others to stay. A few were turned away, not with violence, but with silence. Ruth's people knew who belonged and who didn't. One man tried to build a towering lodge out of shipped lumber, boasting that his design would change everything. He poured stone footings, hoisted a roof too high, angled his walls sharp and proud. It lasted 2 winters. In the third, wind sheared off his east wall like a blade slicing through canvas. The stove burst. The beams split. He left on foot, head low. A week later, his plot was empty. The remaining wood was stacked neatly for community firewood. His foundation, filled in with clay, the ground reclaimed what didn't listen, but not every outsider failed. A young woman named Clara came from the north with 2 children, and nothing but a mule and a cracked kettle. She had Ruth's eyes, sharp, not cruel. She asked no favors, only space. She built a small clay dome, no larger than a root cellar, lived quiet, worked clean. Eliza visited her once, just to see. Clara was shaping bricks with her bare feet in a trough. A child slept near the wall, curled under a fir. Eliza asked if she needed help. Clara only shook her head, then said, I read about her. Back in Dakota, a man at a depot had a copy of her Earthen Ways. Said it was just a myth, but I knew. Eliza nodded. You're welcome here. Clara never left. A decade after Ruth's passing, a cart arrived, dragging behind it a metal press, not a full printer, just a hand crank and a block-type tray. It was brought by a woman with ink-stained hands named Maureen. She wanted to print books, not just stories, but manuals. The Hollow hesitated, but Maureen offered a proof, a 10-page edition of Earthen Ways, bound in burlap and set in type by hand. The cover bore only a single line. This is not her voice, but we listen for its echo. They approved the print. Soon, small printed versions of Ruth's methods began appearing in faraway towns, sometimes altered, sometimes mocked, but never forgotten. One traveling preacher who received a copy wrote back, I've seen grand cathedrals of stone collapse under snow, and yet these earth homes stand. Perhaps God hides wisdom in the humble. Eliza pinned that letter on her wall and never replied. As Ruth Hollow entered its 3rd decade, it held firm against every storm. The children who once shivered at her door now had children of their own. The cabin remained untouched, the stove never cold, the slope never cracked. One winter, a reporter from a San Francisco paper arrived, sent by rail, then wagon, then foot. He wore city boots, a wool coat too thin for the wind, and spoke in clipped sentences. He asked to interview the town founder. They laughed. There ain't one, someone said. She's gone. Well, who's in charge then? Another voice. The walls, the reporter frowned. I'd like to photograph the original cabin, for history's sake. Eliza met him by the door. No photos, he smiled, indulgent. Surely the public, no one sold her life while she lived. You won't sell it now. He stayed one night, wrote a single paragraph in his paper, buried deep in the back. There is a place, east of the divide, where winter never seems to win. They say it was started by a woman who built a house from dirt. I did not see her, but I saw the warmth she left behind. That was all, and so the valley endures. The frost comes, and the walls hold. The snow rises, and the fire stoves stay lit. Children learn to mix clay before they can spell. Elders rest with hands scarred from shaping earth. Travelers come and go. The Hollow does not grow quickly, but it never shrinks. And every winter someone, no one knows who, leaves a single clay brick at the doorstep of Ruth's cabin, sometimes wrapped in straw, sometimes marked with a name, sometimes blank, but always laid with care, like a prayer, a promise, a memory, because the settlers had laughed when she packed mud instead of chopping logs. They'd scoffed when she knelt in dirt while others raised timber walls. They'd mocked the walls as useless clay, woman's folly, spring melt waiting to happen, and then winter came, and winter couldn't crack it, because Ruth Merrin didn't build for praise, she built for silence, she built for warmth, she built to last, and she did.